The legislation, I think, is worked on hard, a lot of input, and Senator Harkin did a yeoman's job on bringing some of the most important factors that we had in that to the forefront, and we have it in the bill now. Thank you, Madam President, and with that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut, let's just wait 1 minute till we get this cleared out. Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. While my colleague from West Virginia is here, I want to thank him for his leadership on this issue and for the very hard work that he and other colleagues have devoted to this profoundly difficult, challenging, but important issue. And I rise with regret to oppose the compromise agreement that's been reached with the help of our colleagues from Illinois and Maine and across the aisle. It is a compromise, and compromises are to be sought in this day, and it is bipartisan. And that, too, is an objective, a bipartisan compromise. But the fact is, it's a bad deal. And we can do better. We must do better. This nation can do better. We have a moral and historic obligation to do better for the students of today and their brothers and sisters who will be following them over the next 10 years. This deal offers the illusion of lower rates in the short term while delivering higher rates, in some cases in as little as 2 years from now. It forces students back into a system of market-based loans that has failed in the past and will fail in the future. And it subjects students to economic uncertainties wholly unrelated to the actual costs of higher education. We know we need to reduce the costs of tuition and higher education. We know we need to address the overhanging $1 trillion+ of debt that exists from past loans. But this deal exacerbates, not eases, the problem. And yes, it has caps on the interest rates a student may pay, but they creep toward more than double where student loan rates were at the beginning of this month. And yes, it has a low rate, but it is in effect a teaser rate, as the presiding officer has said so well, a teaser rate that has nowhere to go but up. And it lowers the deficit, yes, but it does so by having the federal government reach into the pockets of students and take billions more on top of the $51 billion already extracted in this fiscal year from them and from their hardworking parents. At the heart of this bill is a mistaken premise. It is the premise that it's okay to profit off the backs of students. It's all right to regard students as a revenue source or a profit center. That premise reverses a historic promise, which is we will invest in students, not profit from them. We will support their efforts to gain higher education so they can better themselves and better the country with the skills and education they acquire, not hamper or handicap them and exact from them a crushing burden of debt in the future. That premise reverses a historic promise, and we cannot allow it to go forward without a fight. Every dollar that we extract from those students is a dollar they can't spend on a down payment for a house or a car or a business or an investment. These young people are the economic drivers of our future. Let's be purely selfish about it. How can they build a family, buy a home, start a business if they are hit with an 8% interest rate or higher at a time when we can make it more affordable? Makes no sense. I've spoken to students across the state of Connecticut over these past weeks, and they do the math. They know the results. As many as 86,000 students who attend our colleges and in universities, and I've spoken to many of them, their families, the staff, and teachers who are also doing this math. And they know the best way to reduce our deficit is not to profit from them, but to make possible their higher education so they can bring their innovation and experience and expertise to the marketplace, not make the marketplace dictate the variable rates that they're charged, but enable them to contribute to the marketplace and the American dream by going to college. I understand the temptation of this deal, but we must reject a compromise that saves the American dream for one sibling in a family by taking away from another. My colleague from Rhode Island made this point very eloquently earlier today. If you're a senior in high school right now, you'll do pretty well under this bill when you begin college next year. But look at your younger brother and sister. She will be paying for you. He will be paying more and, in fact, may be denied the opportunity that you have next year because your parents cannot afford to send him to college. The issue of loan rates is complicated, but the math really is pretty simple. There is already more than $1 trillion of crushing loan debt that this bill is not refinancing, provides no debt forgiveness, just market rates that will lead to higher payments and more student debt as we zoom past that $1 trillion mark and raise it even further. The irony here is that the majority of this body has already voted to return to 3.4%. This compromise betrays the majority will of the United States Senate. Instead, it allows those rates to rise as high as 8.25%, graduate Stafford rates as high as 9.5%, and plus rates as high as 10.5%. So we're saying to the parent with 2 children, you can send one to college now with a loan that you take out at current rates, but to pay for that second child, you're going to be seeing rates more than twice as high. Do you think the income of the average American middle-class families is going up 10.5%? Ask the American people. Do as I've done. Go around your state and ask the students and their parents. So let's not kid ourselves. The fact that they're not going to be able to pay and that this compromise relies on a presumption that somehow over the next 2 years we're going to come back, revisit, revise, reshape, and avert disaster. I've only been here 2.5 years, but what I've seen is better to know what the result is going to be than engage in the potential false hope and raise the potential false expectation that somehow everything will be solved next year or the year after before disaster strikes. We should learn something from our experience with sequestration. This bill is not based on an analysis of what the rate needs to be to cover the program's cost. In fact, it requests the GAO to examine and report on what that should be. So I implore my colleagues, instead of voting first and getting the facts later, that we reserve such a life-changing decision until the GAO has advised us on the cost of student loans, and we use that information, necessary information, to set the rates going forward. There are amendments that I believe will improve this bill, and I've co-sponsored them. The amendment that Senators Reid and the presiding officer have offered that would lower the interest rate caps in this bill to the current statutory rate. If this amendment is adopted, we can go back to the people of our states and say, at worst, you will be no worse off than under current law. And we cannot say as much under this compromise bill. I've also co-sponsored Senator Sanders' amendment, which would sunset this legislation after 2 years. If interest rates rise the way they are projected to do, we could be looking at dramatically higher rates within 3 years. And so this sunset clause will force us to come back and revisit them. And I've also filed my own amendment that would expand and make more generous loan repayment assistance programs for borrowers who are struggling right now to make payments under existing loans. At a time when outstanding student debt is $1.2 trillion, we need to make sure that we help and support distressed borrowers at every stage of repayment, and that is the unaddressed need that this body needs to confront. I am hopeful these amendments will be adopted. In the meantime, I must respectfully and regretfully oppose this compromise. We are the greatest nation in the history of the world, as we are fond of saying repeatedly on the floor of this body. But only one thing is certain about the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act, and that is rates will rise inexorably, inevitably, inexcusably. They will exceed current rates, and we must stand and fight to prevent that kind of betrayal of the fundamental American promise in higher education and the American dream. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. Most of my colleagues might, I assume, look at these pictures and think they depict facilities owned by ExxonMobil. Sorry, Madam President. Most of my colleagues would look at these pictures and think they depict facilities owned by ExxonMobil or BP. But this is, amazingly enough, a picture of Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley, to most Americans and most people in this chamber, if they know of it, is a bank. It used to be an investment bank. Now it's just considered a bank. Let me explain. Morgan Stanley owns a company called Transmontane, a petroleum and chemical transportation and storage company, and Heidmar Inc., which reportedly manages more than 100 oil tankers, tankers that look like this. Today I held a banking subcommittee hearing that the presiding officer attended, as did Senator Merkley and Senator Toomey, to examine how the line between banks and commercial enterprises is blurring. Interestingly, these large institutions combine banks and trading firms and energy suppliers and oil refiners and warehouses and shipping companies and oil tankers and mining companies. Federally insured bank holding companies, once in the business of providing checking and savings accounts to workers or loans to small businesses, are now also in the business of owning physical commodities, aluminum, oil, electricity. Witnesses testified at the subcommittee hearing that these risky Wall Street practices are actually inflating prices for manufacturers and consumers. Morgan Stanley and J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs take their cut when you fill up your tank, take their cut when you buy a Coke or buy a beer in an aluminum can, take their cut increasingly in the copper market, a metal that is in all kinds of industrial products. A recent article in the New York Times said, and I'll quote, the maneuvering in markets for oil and wheat and cotton and coffee and more have brought billions in profits to investment banks like Goldman and J.P. Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley, while forcing customers to pay more every time they fill up a gas tank, flick on a light switch, open a beer, or buy a cell phone. For years, our nation separated banking from traditional commerce. But about 13, 14 years ago, after years of eroding that protection, Congress finally tore down what was left of that wall. Beyond just combining commercial banking with insurance and investment banking, banks are now allowed to trade in commodities and to engage in a variety of non-financial activities. 4 years later, after that 1999 repeal, the Federal Reserve enabled the first financial holding company to trade in physical commodities. The justification for this is a familiar one. Other companies were doing it, they told us. Banks were at a competitive disadvantage. Over the next 6 years, the rules unraveled, becoming looser and looser until the loopholes were big enough for these six megabanks, now $600 billion in assets, up to $2.3 billion in assets. The loopholes were big enough for these six megabanks to jump through. The expansion of our financial system into traditional areas of commerce, from crude oil to natural gas to mining and shipping, hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's been accompanied by a host of anti-competitive activities. These activities threaten consumers. They have threatened American businesses that rely upon efficient markets and arm's-length transactions. They especially threaten American manufacturing when they buy and sell and manage and transport and store metals. From speculation to the oil and gas markets to inflated prices for energy to energy manipulation, we know the role of banks has expanded. Banks have expanded far beyond their traditional roles. There's been little public awareness of or debate about the massive expansion of our largest financial institutions into new areas of the economy. That's in part because regulators have been less than transparent about basic facts. We can't get from the Federal Reserve the information. Whether you're a citizen, whether you're a reporter, whether you're a senator sitting on the banking committee, you can't get from the Federal Reserve the information we need to know about the governance and these rules about commodity trading by the banks. It's also because these institutions are so complex and so dense and so opaque and so impossible for people to understand that they're impossible, that we simply can't figure out what we need to figure out. The six largest U.S. bank companies, holding companies, have 14,000 subsidiaries. Six largest U.S. banks, holding companies, have 14,000 subsidiaries. Fewer than 20 of those 14,000 are traditional banks. There are three important issues here that concern me, that Morgan Stanley can own the refineries and can own the ships. There are three important issues that concern me, whether it's Morgan Stanley, whether it's Goldman Sachs, whether it's J.P. Morgan Chase, whether it's aluminum, whether it's copper, whether it's electricity, whether it's oil. Three things. The lessons of this hearing were three things. First, these institutions can control physical goods and financial contracts based upon these goods, meaning they know more about the trading of these goods because they store the aluminum in 24 warehouses in Detroit, or because they're moving the oil in these tankers. They know more about transactions, know more about price, know more about movement of goods. So that means they can trade on inside information. It gives them an advantage in proprietary trading. It means they can manipulate markets. Second, these institutions, these banks that own the oil tanker and own the refineries, these banks have access to cheap funding, cheaper funding from the Federal Reserve. That means us as taxpayers, that they can use to finance their commodities activities. I'll say that again. It means because they can go to the window, they can get cheaper financing. These banks can get cheaper financing. They say there's a wall between their traditional bank activities and what they're doing owning these commodities and buying and selling and transporting and storing and gaming the markets. But they can get money cheaper from taxpayers. They can borrow money less expensive rate than anybody else, than their competitors who also might own oil tankers, who also might do refinery. Third, they're exposing themselves and us, the economy, to risks that could threaten our financial system. Just imagine the economic, the environmental, and the reputational impact to a megabank of an Exxon Valdez or a BP oil spill. Think of the economic impact that could have on the stability of the bank and the success of the bank, and therefore the stability of the whole financial system. Today was the first of what I expect to be several hearings on this issue. Taxpayers have a right to know what is happening. American citizens have a say in our financial system because taxpayers are the ones who will be asked to rescue these mega banks yet again if the unthinkable, which almost inevitably happens in this world over time, if the unthinkable happens. Madam President, I ask that the remainder of my remarks be put a different place in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. 1935, Senator Robert Wagner of New York introduced the National Labor Relations Act. Also known as the Wagner Act, this bill would prove to be one of the most important pieces of legislation in our nation's history. This desk at which I sit was used by Senator Hugo Black of Alabama, who was Franklin Roosevelt's favorite Southern senator, they said later, to be a member of the Supreme Court. Senator Black sat at this desk and helped draft that legislation with the National Labor Relations Act. In fact, did some of the early work on the Social Security Act, what he proposes a 30-hour work week that later helped Senator Wagner pave the way for the National Labor Relations Act. Before President Roosevelt signed the bill, American workers were routinely harassed and fired for organizing unions. American workers were often intimidated. They were prevented from bargaining collectively. The Wagner Act changed that. 1 year after its passage in 1936, this law gave rubber workers in Akron, Ohio, the legal tools needed to protect against poor working conditions and to protest the conditions they were working under. The bill authorized an independent federal agency consisting of presidential appointees confirmed by the Senate. The National Labor Relations Board protects American workers, protects union members, private sector employees without a union card, both, to work together to improve their wages or working conditions. Today, the NLRB is needed perhaps more than ever. Let me tell you a story real quick, Madam President. A few years ago, I was in Cincinnati at a dinner, and sitting at the table in front of me were 6 or 7 middle-aged women, half white, half minority, perhaps. They had just signed their first union contract with the Service Employees International Union. These 5 or 6 women were the negotiators with on behalf of 1,200 janitors negotiating with the downtown Cincinnati business owners. There was an empty seat at the table, so I went and sat down. I said, "What does having this union mean to you?" And they had just signed the contract that day. One woman said, "I'm 51 years old. This is the first time in my life I've ever had a paid 1-week vacation." And think about the number of Americans that don't have a paid 1-week vacation. I mean, for people in these jobs that dress like this, for the Pages sitting here, most of their parents, I imagine, are used to working a place where they get a week or a 2 or 3-week paid vacation. Much of America doesn't. That's just one of the things a union has brought to this country in giving people those opportunities. 2013, the reason I say the NLRB is needed perhaps now more than ever, 2013, state legislatures are curbing collective bargaining rights. 2 years ago in Ohio, state legislature and Governor Kasich took away collective bargaining rights for all intents and purposes for public employee workers. The voters of Ohio said no to that. 61% of them struck that law down in a referendum. But nonetheless, the anti-union efforts from the most pro-corporate, conservative, far-right state legislators and state legislatures across the country continue unabated. Workers are still being punished for discussing pay and bonuses with one another. For 78 years, the NLRB has been instrumental in addressing the challenges American workers face. Senator Wagner explained on the floor, it's necessary to ensure a wide distribution of wealth between management and labor to maintain a full flow of purchasing power and to prevent recurrent depressions. We know when workers make decent wages, workers buy the cars made in this country. They buy the appliances. They go to the hardware store. They pay their property tax. They buy homes. They renovate their homes. They do things that put money into the economy. If you only have a sliver of people that are very wealthy in a declining middle class, the purchasing power and the growth in the economy tends to diminish. And that's not what kind of country we want, or it's not what kind of country we've had since World War II. But just a few years after the Great Recession, there's a widening gap between the average wage of workers and corporate and heads of corporations. For families struggling to make ends meet after a breadwinner was unfairly forced off the assembly line, the NLRB matters. If we do not confirm the President's nominees, then workers like Kevin from Akron will have no recourse against retaliation for his union activity. Kevin and his co-workers wanted to form a union to stop a 12-hour shift policy from being put in place at their place of employment. The company fired 6 workers, including Kevin, for this union activity. While the NLRB ordered the company to reinstate the workers, the NLRB said the company was wrong under federal law. The workers should be reinstated. The D.C. Circuit Court, peopled in large part by by judges that almost always do the bidding of the wealthiest corporations in this country. The D.C. Circuit Court delayed enforcement of the case until the pending challenge to the President's 2012 nominees is resolved in court, or the board has a Senate-confirmed quorum. That's why Kevin is a human face of why America needs a fully staffed National Labor Relations Board with the legal quorum needed to do its job. We should confirm these board members. We should make sure that workers like Kevin receive the workplace protections, whether they're union members, whether they're not union members, the workplace protections they deserve. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate in a quorum call earlier today, they began debate on the Transportation and HUD spending bill for fiscal year 2014. They really only worked on one amendment. They passed the amendment by David Vitter, which would prohibit housing assistance benefits for people convicted of aggravated sexual abuse. They're back tomorrow for more debate on the transportation spending bill. Over in the House, they're debating the defense spending bill for 2014. Votes expected shortly on a number of amendments, but many more to go, and you can follow that on C-SPAN. Just a few minutes ago, Sherrod Brown here on the Senate floor was speaking about the nominees for the National Labor Relations Board. We covered a hearing earlier today, the Senate Health Committee, looking at those nominees, and you can find that in our video library at cspan.org. We'll also show it to you later in our program schedule.
Madam President?
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to talk about legislation that we're currently considering, and it's a welcome development that we're actually working on appropriation bills on the Senate floor, and I want to commend the work of Chairwoman Mikulski of the Appropriations Committee, her ranking member, Senator Shelby, as well as both Chairman Murray and Ranking Member Collins on the so-called THUD bill. Everything in Washington has an acronym. So it is with this, the Transportation and Housing Appropriations Bill. And as many people know, when you consider those appropriations and you consider the subject matter, it's pretty broad and diverse. And I just give you maybe a five-part summation here of what we're talking about. It means investing, of course, in transportation infrastructure, providing housing and services to very vulnerable Americans, supporting our communities and addressing the foreclosure crisis, which is still with us in so many ways, as the presiding officer knows so well and has worked so hard on this problem over many years, ensuring the safety of our transportation system, and then number 5, promoting sustainability in our communities. I wanted to talk first about Amtrak. Amtrak is part of our transportation infrastructure that not only is critically important for a state like Pennsylvania, but really the entire eastern seaboard and really across the whole country. It's one of the reasons we can move not just people, but goods and services and the transactions that occur when people are able to get from one place to another. The Senate bill that we're considering includes almost $1.5 billion for Amtrak, preserving the federal commitments to provide safe, reliable, and energy-efficient passenger rail transportation for more than 31 million travelers, and that's an annual number, plus an additional 235 million commuter trips that depend upon Amtrak and on its infrastructure along the Northeast Corridor. Unfortunately, the House bill guts funding for Amtrak, cutting the appropriations by a third for fiscal year 2013. This is the lowest level of funding in over a decade. It makes no sense in a lot of ways to try to find savings in a bill like this at such an extreme level. It makes no sense at all in terms of our economy. Due to contract and debt service payment commitments, this would mean Amtrak only has $100 million for capital investments. The Northeast Corridor alone needs $782 million per year to address longstanding state of good repair projects. So not even 1/7 of the dollars we need for state of good repair. This isn't just a nice thing to do every year. You've got to fix the infrastructure if you're running a transportation system, and especially if you're running Amtrak. So that's not only a safety issue, but it's a jobs issue. You could put at risk some 10,000 jobs and possibly eliminate some existing Amtrak routes. In 2012, over 6.1 million Amtrak passengers traveled at Pennsylvania stations, and this number is expected to increase in 2013. Ridership has continued to grow over the past several years, and it's reached an all-time high last year and is on track to break that record in 2013. I was just talking to folks at Amtrak today, and they talked about the tremendous growth in ridership. Now, that's good for a lot of reasons. It's not just nice for Amtrak. Most importantly, it's good for our environment, less people driving cars that have an impact on emissions, air emissions. It's also probably a great stress reliever for people. Driving and working is a challenge, getting from one place to another. Riding on a train can allow you to do work and maybe allow you to be more rested. It probably cuts down on traffic fatalities, although I don't have a study that backs that up. But there's no question that we want to make sure we make these investments in Amtrak, and I hope that we can get a bipartisan agreement ultimately and have some of the features of bipartisanship we've seen here in the Senate. We also know that Amtrak, just in it from a Pennsylvania perspective, is a job creator. It employs over 2,600 Pennsylvanians, and these jobs could be in jeopardy if these cuts are maintained. The other aspect, and I'll end with this on Amtrak, are the suppliers that are affected, and of course that's a big jobs issue as well. Let me move to the second part of my remarks today about this very important appropriations bill, and that's another acronym, the Community Development Block Grants. A lot of people might know this acronym better than THUD, the Transportation, Housing and Urban Development Bill. The Community Development Block Grant program is so important for a variety of reasons. One of the most important reasons that we should focus on is that this is one of the few remaining federal programs where the federal government says to local governments, here are some resources. These are taxpayer resources, so you have to guard them, safeguard them, and spend them wisely. But we're giving you these federal funds so you can make a decision about what's best for your community. That's what community development block grants are all about. There's not a one-size-fits-all federal Washington way to spend these dollars. And that's why I can't understand why some people here want to make the kind of really dangerous cuts to these block grants that some want to make. We know that the Senate bill includes a little more than $3.1 billion for these block grants, I should say $3.15 billion, less than the 2013 bill, but it's $352 million more than what the President has asked for in this year meaning 2014. According to calculations by HUD, the funding level provided in the Senate bill will support an estimated 80,900 jobs, twice the level in the House bill, 80,900 jobs. That's a good reason to support the Senate bill, but that's not the only reason standing alone. But that's a big jobs number. The House bill contains the lowest amount ever provided to the program. I wish we could stand up and say, you know what? Communities across the country don't need block grants. They don't need to even decide what's best for their community because all the problems are taken care of. Everything is wonderful, and all these communities are in just perfect shape, so let's just have a big cut to the program. That would be an interesting scenario if it were true. The reality is that in a lot of communities where they've had to deal with the ravages of a foreclosure crisis, where the greatest number of Americans ever probably lost their homes, maybe the highest number since the 1930s, number one. Number two, they had to deal with a jobs crisis, in addition to the foreclosure crisis, and of course the two are closely related. We just went below, a couple months ago, 500,000 people out of work in Pennsylvania, but we're still at about 490,000 people out of work. So these communities that have had to deal with several avalanches of problems, foreclosure crisis, jobs crisis, and then all of the results of both of those, all of the trauma that has been heaped on these communities. Now we're told by some in Washington, your problems are solved. You don't need any grant funding from the federal government to help you decide what's best for your community, whether you can use it for foreclosure mitigation or whether you can use it for job creation, whether you can use that limited resource from the federal government to bring a company into your town. To be told in essence, by implication, you don't need that, is really an insult to local communities across the country. We know that the block grant program began in 1975, and in its first year was funded at a $2.47 billion number. Why do I give you that specific number from the mid-1970s? Well, up until now, the lowest amount it has ever received, but still $837 million more than the level provided by the House bill. So what the House is doing here is setting records which they shouldn't want to set, to be in a race to see who can in a more devastating fashion, almost decapitate the block grant program. Since the program started, the number of grantees has doubled, making the impact of the cuts even greater on communities. These grants, these community development block grants, allow 47 Pennsylvania communities to address local needs. They get to decide, not the federal government. They get their resources, and they decide at the local level. We know that countless communities have received these funds, or have also been, these funds have also been made available to state governments. Municipalities depend on this funding for economic development projects, which I mentioned before. Just give you some examples of individual cities. The city of Philadelphia, which has had an unemployment rate at 10% or above for as long as anyone can remember. We're into several years now where the unemployment rate has been 10 or higher, meaning that between 60 and 70,000 or higher people have been out of work in that city. CDBG funding in Philadelphia was used to stem the foreclosure crisis, helping nearly 4,000 homeowners avoid foreclosure through housing counseling, funded by the Community Development Block Grant Program. Prior to the funding cuts, these grants provided annually enough resources that 2,818 jobs were created annually. Now, in a city that has 60 to 70,000 people out of work consistently for several years, 2,818 jobs is a lot of jobs. Philadelphia is a big city, but that's still a lot of jobs that are directly a result of community development block grant funding. That's why you hear from mayors that are Democrat and Republican and independent. Whatever their party, they all seem to come together on these block grant funds because they know that they are better judges of what's best for their community. And the city of Philadelphia developed its own foreclosure mitigation program. They developed the program, they came up with the idea, implemented it, and then used federal money to support it. And yet you have some people in Washington saying, don't worry about it, you don't need those funds, and we're going to decide what are priorities in your town. That's really what they're saying. They may not want to hear this, but that's what they're saying. When you say to someone, we're going to drastically cut funding for a successful grant program that has funded projects that you have decided are important, or you might have even created in the case of this foreclosure mitigation program. In essence, what they're saying is not just the House or the Senate or any part of our government is going to cut this program dramatically. They are making the decision for those local communities. So all these folks in Washington who talk about local decision making and then gut the program, I think have their credibility dramatically undermined. I'll give you a few more examples before I wrap up. The city of Pittsburgh directed some of its grant dollars to promote home ownership and affordable housing. So that's our second largest city using these grant funds in a way that was most important to them. The Lehigh Valley, which is the eastern seaboard of our state, just north of Philadelphia, cities like Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, those communities, they've used this funding to encourage private sector investment. So they made a decision in their community that we're not going to use these funds for foreclosure mitigation or housing. We're going to focus on job creation. We're going to focus on getting private sector businesses to locate in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. They made that decision, not us. They made that decision. Some people in the House think that they should substitute their judgment for the people of the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. I think that's a mistake. In Lancaster and York County, down in the southern border of our state, a portion of these grant funds were used to reduce blight and revitalize historic downtowns. Again, they made that decision, and they've used these dollars for that. And none of these communities are saying that these dollars shouldn't be safeguarded, shouldn't be spent and treated as precious taxpayer dollar resources. No one is saying that they shouldn't be scrutinized. No one is saying that they shouldn't be audited. No one is saying that they shouldn't be carefully examined as to how they spend those dollars. All they're saying to us is, let's keep the community development block grant at a reasonable level. They're not asking for the moon. They're not asking for a doubling of funding or some some great amount of money that the federal government can't afford, but they're saying, let us decide that. Washington decides a lot of things. That's the way our system works. But on this one, they're saying to us, let us decide, not Washington. So we know the value of the program, and we know that over the past few years, these grant funds have been reduced by nearly 25%. So just level funding, unfortunately, becomes a significant victory. Further loss of funding will directly harm these communities that rely upon these grant funds to address their most pressing needs. As I mentioned, mayors across the country rely upon these grants for vital services, and I've heard directly from mayors in both parties about this. So further cuts to the block grant program will have a detrimental effect on cities and municipalities, some of whom are the ones who have suffered the most from the foreclosure crisis, from the economic recession, and the job-killing impact of that recession. And they're just, if they're not digging out, they've just gotten out of the hole, and they're not feeling all that secure yet. These grant funds allow them to make those decisions, allow them to make the investments that they want to make. So, Madam President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Earlier today, the Senate voted to limit debate on the transportation HUD spending bill, moving forward with debate on amendments. They passed an amendment by David Vitter, which would prohibit housing assistance benefits for people convicted of sexual abuse. That'll be all the work today on the transportation bill, but the Senate's back tomorrow for more consideration of more amendments. This is 2014 spending, the new fiscal year beginning October 1st, of course. Over in the House, they're working on the 2014 defense bill. As a matter of fact, a series of amendment votes underway right now, and you can follow that over on C-SPAN. Off the floor today, a Senate panel approved President Obama's choice for UN envoy, UN ambassador. In a voice vote, writes the Associated Press, the Foreign Relations Committee advanced nominations of 5 senior diplomats, including former White House advisor Samantha Power for UN ambassador and former State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland for Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Senate continues in a quorum call. They are likely done with most legislative work for the evening, finishing up so far only one amendment to the Transportation and HUD spending bill, an amendment by David Vitter which would prohibit housing assistance benefits for people convicted of aggravated sexual abuse. More debate on transportation HUD expected tomorrow in the Senate. The House continues meanwhile in the debate in the votes over Defense 2014 spending. And as this quorum call continues, we're going to take you to a conversation from this morning's Washington Journal on how self-employed people are impacted by the health care law.
For the National Association for the Self-Employed, here to talk about health care taxes and this group of workers in the country. Who are they?
So the self-employed represent 22 million Americans who are out there all across the country working hard to build a business for them and their families. And they're an interesting demographic. You know, when you're talking about the American small business community, the self-employed represent almost 80% of that community. So this is a big contingency of that. You know, they're really interested in how we're going to move forward with tax policy and tax reform. But the biggest single expenditure for the self-employed is actually health insurance. So as we're here today talking about how the Affordable Care Act is going to impact them, this is a major topic for them.
So break it down along age, race, and education attainment, because I want to show our viewers, this is from the BLS's website, and it's from 2009. It shows self-employment rates by selected characteristics, and these are the 2009 annual averages, breaking down the years. So who are they when it comes to age?
So it's an interesting demographic. So you have like your young entrepreneurs that everyone's, you know, talking about, if it's because of Kickstarter or, you know, Fundable. But then you have this really interesting demographic where you find the majority of the self-employed kind of fall between like the 40 and 65-year-old mark. And what we have found out from our own research that we've done is that these are actually people who have been in the workforce, who have been quite successful and have decided to start their own business. They've either decided that they could do something better and more efficiently, they want some more time with their family, or this is genuinely just a second career for them. You know, they didn't want to retire, they wanted to continue to have some income coming in. So it's a slightly more mature population than I think most people think. From a gender demographic, it skews a little bit more male than female, about, I think, depending on what you're looking at, like 60-40 is really where we fall. But it's wide. It's all across the country. You also see sometimes when you're looking at the data, which can be misleading, is a sole proprietor may be under the head of household. So it could be a husband, but really that wife, that partner of theirs is actually a co-owner and helping that business succeed. So across the country, we see a lot of it is it's a partnership. It's a husband and wife or a couple who's working to build their business.
And what are they doing?
So they're doing everything. You're going to see a lot more specialized technology. Technology is very big, but you're also going to see your more traditional accountants, attorneys, lawyers, manufacturers, farmers. I mean, it's all over the gamut of who these people are and what they're doing.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics divides them by incorporated self-employed and unincorporated. What does that mean?
So you have, depending on your tax filing status, and this is where when we start talking about tax reform becomes a big deal. Most self-employed identify themselves as sole proprietors, about 60% of the self-employed population. The rest are then, you know, designated as LLC, S Corp, C Corp, pass-throughs. I mean, there's tons of categorizations. And each one is treated very differently in the tax code. Your sole proprietor is someone who does not have a more protected business entity. So they file their taxes 4 times a year. They're actually, in most cases, paying more money to the federal government in advance than their actual tax bill. So that's when you're looking at tax designation. It becomes a little bit more complicated.
What about the level of education for the self-employed?
So you find a very highly educated population. You also, one of the things I'm not sure if you can poll is you also find that the self-employed are homeowners. And this is really important as we start talking about tax reform and how that could impact discussions about limiting the home mortgage deduction. I think on our last statistical information, about 70% of the self-employed are homeowners. So again, highly educated with at least a college degree, if not a postgraduate degree, homeowners.
Let me show this chart. Again, I think from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it shows the difference between unincorporated and incorporated. I want you to talk about this a little bit, because you see in red, the unincorporated, the self-employment rate is much higher for those with less than a high school diploma.
Yeah.
But then when you look at advanced degree, the incorporated self-employed is higher.
Right.
So explain what these two are doing. What's the difference?
So probably without reading correctly, I'm reading this upside down. My assumption would be is that the higher red that you're talking about, people with a high school degree or less, are probably your more your mechanics, your more industrial workers. On the other side, oh, there we go. On the other side, with the advanced degree, I'm assuming those are actually where you're going to find a lot of your doctors, your lawyers, your accountants, who probably are part of a firm but are actually designated as self-employed because the way that their law firm is set up, their accounting firm is set up. So that's where I could probably break that down looking at that.
Okay. So we are taking your questions about the self-employed in this country. We want to hear from the self-employed themselves. We have a fourth line set aside for you, 202-585-3883. Start dialing in now so we can hear your stories and your questions about the health care law and the tax structure for the self-employed. Let me just spend a little bit of time on your association.
Yeah.
How many members do you have, and what's your role in all of this?
Absolutely. So the National Association for the Self-Employed is the only association that is advocating, educating, and promoting the self-employed. So we have roughly about just under 200,000 members. The self-employed community as a whole, though, is 22 million. We also include micro business owners. So those are the owners of businesses with 10 or less employees. Huge demographic of people across the country. And really what the NASC set out to do is actually grow and expand and educate those members about how to run the best business they can, how they can be successful day in and day out, and how they can actually make some of the challenges of running a business easier for them. And as you can imagine, there are some significant legislative challenges and regulatory laws that our members have to deal with. So we're there to help. I mean, it's a simple mission. We take great pride in it. We love to see a person who comes to us who is starting their business and in 10 years is a flourishing small business that is providing a great source of income for them and their families.
So are they seeking your help on this health care law? And if so, what are the top questions from these self-employed?
Yeah,
what are their concerns?
Huge concerns. I think when it really breaks down to is the education piece. I mean, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of change. And so we're really trying to be kind of that steady ship in the harbor when there's a hurricane going on around us. The challenges are really, how are they going to purchase health insurance? How is it different for them? How much is it going to cost? I mean, more than anything, the self-employed, I think, over the years have really faced some significant challenges. Going back to your demographic slide, you know, you're seeing an older population of individuals who are self-employed. They have challenges getting health insurance. You know, when you're 40 to 65 years old, things start going wrong. You know, you've either had maybe a bout with cancer, or you've had maybe heart disease in your family. All of those conditions have really been challenging, have been a barrier for the self-employed to purchase health insurance. So they tend to get very high deductible, more catastrophic coverage. So when it relates to health insurance, they're really excited. You know, they're not going to have any denial based on pre-existing conditions. They're going to be able to get a quality health plan. The issue is the cost of that. And that is where they really fall down, is where, how much is this going to cost me? How much is this going to impact my business? And right now, as we stand at, I think we're at July 23rd, the issue is a lot of people don't know how much that's going to cost, and that's becoming a bigger issue for the self-employed as we move towards October 1, when they can enroll in the exchange market.
What kind of coverage do the self-employed buy now?
I mean, they're buying high deductible catastrophic plans. So this is literally if something major, you know, if they're working in their business and they're injured, I mean, but they're paying extremely high amounts of money for, excuse me, for very little coverage. And that, when we talk about the benefits of the health care law, because there are many of them, this is one of them, is that you're going to be able to get a plan that is going to tell you right up in front how much it's going to cost, how much your out-of-pocket expenses are going to be, and what kind of coverage you should be expecting from your doctor, your pharmacist, your ambulatory care.
Well, let's go to Jim first. He's in Gainesville, Texas, independent caller and self-employed. Jim, what do you do?
I am a farmer. I also contract for some drug and device medical research.
Okay, what's your question or comment?
Well, a concern I have is what is it going to cost me under the new health care law, and what I'll be getting, for the cost, and a concern that I have if there's, if I'm not have the same latitude to choose what service need the best. And what I did preemptively, in fact, when the law, Affordable Health Care Law passed, was that I'm also a veteran. I enrolled in the to have as a backup the VA take care of medical services. I've been out of the services for years. I've never used the VA for services. Only in the last year did it, and frankly, it's a bureaucracy that's incredibly difficult to get proper care. I always assumed that maybe the care would be very similar to the types of care and criteria that maybe something like Medicare would have. It's nothing near as good as Medicare, but I'm just not sure right now, or up until recently I had catastrophic, but I'm at an age where I think I probably need to hedge my bet a little bit better, but I don't know what I'm going to be getting.
Jim, can I ask you, how much was catastrophic costing you?
Probably about between $300 and $500 a month.
Okay. And Jim, did you know that under the health care law that won't fit the law's requirement that you have insurance? Catastrophic coverage is not enough under the health care law.
Well, and that was also why being covered under the VA, my understanding was that would also serve as.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's have our guests respond. Yeah, I mean, there's like a whole host of questions there, so I'll try to knock through them pretty succinctly. So you as a veteran are absolutely eligible for health benefits under the VA. And one of the things that will happen come October 1, when you go to the exchange portals, and if it's going to be online or via paper or you can actually call, they're actually going to run you through a series of questions that are going to trigger if you are eligible for care under the Veterans Administration, or if you're going to be eligible for Medicare, Medicaid, or any state-run program. So right away, your application is going to trigger that you may be able to find coverage under a federal program as it stands. That being said, if you also decide that you want a more robust coverage, there's actually going to be 4 levels of health care that any individual purchasing in the exchange marketplace will be eligible for. So you have a platinum, a gold, silver, and bronze. The difference between those 4 is really the out-of-pocket expenses. Now, hopefully you're familiar with the fact that the health care law also caps the out-of-pocket expenses for an individual and a family in the new health care law. But if you buy a platinum plan, you're going to pay a higher premium but a much lower, if any, out-of-pocket expenses. And then it's a sliding scale down to your bronze plan, where you will have a lower monthly premium, but you may hit that cap of out-of-pocket expenses over the course of the year. So you are going to have some choices. I think one of the things that has been challenging, and especially for the self-employed that have had a little bit more ability to be flexible, if it is to buy a very comprehensive plan or to buy a more catastrophic, high deductible plan, is that you're not really going to have that choice because of the essential health benefits that are mandated by the federal government. And then if you're in a state that has decided to add on to those essential health benefits, every health plan has to cover at least those 10 categories, if not more. So you are going to have a more richer product, and there's a pro and a con to that. The pro being is that if you're going to have a more substantive coverage of health care. The con is that is going to drive up those costs. So I think I've answered all of his questions. I know there were a lot, and those were really good ones. But absolutely, just getting back to it, for anyone who's listening, the application process for the exchange market will actually flag you if you're eligible for other federal programs that could help you with the cost of health insurance.
Katie Bleedstra is taking your questions. If you're self-employed or have questions about how this all works, is taking your questions about the health care and taxes. She's with the National Association for the Self-Employed, the Director of Government Affairs there. And if you're self-employed, we want to hear from you. We have a special line set aside, 202-585-3883. We'll go to Don next in New Jersey, independent caller. Hi, Don.
Hi.
Go ahead with your question or comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the fact that I found I used to have insurance, and I was paying, I think, $500 or $600 a month for the insurance that I got. I'm 58 years old, and